Madeiran Portuguese migrated to the Anglophone Caribbean over a period of 140 years from 1835 to 1975. Wherever they went in the Caribbean, Portuguese remained a minority group within the wider host societies. The first Madeiran labourers in the Caribbean arrived in British Guyana in 1835, the year after the abolition of slavery. 1835 was the beginning of both official and unofficial migration of thousands of Madeirans to the region. Over 12,000 Madeirans went to British Guyana in the decade after 1835. Only a few hundred contract labourers left Madeira for Guyana before the Portuguese authorities prohibited the operation in 1836. The thousands who migrated from Madeira after that time went for personal reasons, mostly in search of their fortunes. Madeiran migration to the other Caribbean territories began later, in 1845 and 1846. Other Portuguese found their way to the Caribbean, including Sephardic Jews in the 18th century, and persons from mainland Portugal and Portuguese territories, such as the Azores and Cape Verde. However, by far the largest number of Portuguese hailed from the Madeira Islands and comprised both Catholic immigrants and Presbyterian refugees fleeing religious persecution. For Madeirans migrating in the 19th century, the push factor included social, economic, and political issues, and the pull factors included a promise of economic self-betterment and the prospect of higher wages. Socio-economic factors, as well as overpopulation, had reduced the standard of living in Madeira to the extent that migration became a matter of survival for many. In the 19th century, Madeira experienced a series of social and economic crises, especially as a result of the Civil War of 1828-34 and post-1847, known as Ano de Fome, or the Year of Hunger, which affected Madeira and Porto Santo. This crisis was caused by a disease attacking potato crops, which had become a staple. The decline in the wine market during the 1840s and the vine disease of 1852 and 1870 resulted in widespread unemployment among agricultural workers. These workers constituted the main group that tended to migrate to the West Indies. Generally speaking, Robert Harney's point about the type of Portuguese migrant of the 19th century is valid for the Caribbean setting as well. Quote, "Immigrants are rarely statistically or culturally representative of the country they leave behind. The vast majority of Portuguese migrants were island people, peasants, fishermen, sailors with limited educational backgrounds." In 1835, Madeira, an Atlantic archipelago of 120,000 inhabitants, was often described as overpopulated. According to Nepomuceno, figures for legal migration averaged 716 persons a year from the 1840s to the 1860s. By the end of the 19th century, official migration accounted for 14% of Madeira's population, excluding the clandestine immigrants, such as those fleeing military service. The legisladores, that is, those paid to scour the countryside for potential migrants, were crucial in this migratory movement. After the 1840s, family and village chain migration became more commonplace, with whole families and neighborhoods migrating. For all migrants, the push factors also included the religious strife between Catholics and Protestants in 1844 to 46, the result of Dr. Robert Reed Calley's sojourn in Madeira. The pull factors consequently included the promise of religious freedom, particularly in Trinidad, where religious liberty had been proclaimed. In Madeira, social conflict arising from changing religious patterns coincided with economic difficulties, causing a mass exodus of a few thousand Madeirans. What began as the evangelical teaching of the Bible in small schools and the distribution of free medicines and medical care dramatically concluded in a volatile clash of religious denominations. While other territories officially received just 2,500 immigrants, or fewer, in the first 3 decades of Madeiran migration, British Guyana received tens of thousands of Madeirans. During the mid-19th century, British Guyana accounted for 70% of all Madeiran migration to the British Caribbean, official and unofficial. At that time, Madeirans went to other destinations such as Brazil and the United States until 1910, including Hawaii. By 1861, there were 21,811 Portuguese citizens in British Guyana, which ultimately welcomed some 40,000 immigrants. Migrants to British Guyana maintained close ties with Madeira in the early years of migration, and there was eventually some return migration, a phenomenon which occurred less frequently in other territories. The Portuguese were generally viewed as hard-working and as hoarders of money, to the extent that a governor in Trinidad made the following comment in 1869, quote, "The Portuguese are numerically not unimportant, but are neither wealthy nor influential, being chiefly small shopkeepers and gardeners." Entirely destitute of all political views or objects, they would cheerfully submit to any changes which did not interfere with their making and hoarding money. But they would never take a single step to carry such changes into effect. Unquote. Madeirans were generally welcomed in the Caribbean because of political and economic factors, and because of their potential and actual economic contributions to their host societies. However, their presence was not always welcome by some members of the working classes, in the main descendants of Africans who had been enslaved on Caribbean estates. In fact, in both British Guyana and St. Vincent, there were several uprisings against the Portuguese in the 19th century. By the 20th century, any existing anti-Portuguese sentiments took non-violent, non-physical forms, but hostile undercurrents endured in some territories.
On 3rd May 1835, after a voyage of 78 days, the Louisa Bailey docked in Demerara with 40 Madeiran emigrants, bound for Plantation Thomas of R.G. Butts and for Plantations La Penitence and Lilienthal of James Allboy. Why did emigrants from a 286-mile island, Madeira, off the coast of Morocco, journey to a continental British colony on the northern tip of South America? 3 factors made such a move a reality. 1. The abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies created a labour gap. 2. The long-standing alliance between Portugal and England. 3. The political, military and economic problems in Madeira in the 1830s. Sugar had been grown in Madeira since 1452. By 1500, the island was the world's largest producer of sugar. The sugar was grown by peasant farmers. Suffering now the economic depression and political troubles, they were eager to emigrate. The first decade of the arrival of the Madeireans in Demerara was difficult. Disease and death plagued those years. At the same time, strong objections against emigration were raised by the Madeirean civil and ecclesiastical authorities, who feared the loss of their labourers. In British Guyana, the census and registrar's reports classified the population according to their so-called racial origin, namely 1. European, 2. African, 3. Amerindian, 4. Portuguese, 5. East Indian, 6. Mixed. And when the Chinese arrived, they were added to the list. In post-emancipation society, a correlation was made between the individual's occupation and his ethnic background. Thus, even after the abolition of slavery, the Africans were still associated with manual labour, and Indians who were brought in as indentured labourers were slotted into this labour group. After the Portuguese moved from the cane fields into commerce and opened a rash of shops, they became synonymous with shopkeepers or petty traders. By 1845, most of the Portuguese had moved off the Demerara plantations, bought small plots of land, and moved into the huckster and retail trade. In 1843, the first import of goods from Madeira by the Portuguese was noted by both the Madeiran and Demerara press. The Portuguese were long masters in the field of trade, and the Madeiran emigrant brought with him this flair and expertise. The Portuguese also brought their expertise of blending rum. Their rum shops mushroomed in city and country, making good profits. By 1852, 4/5 of the retail rum shops were owned by the Portuguese. They retained that monopoly well into the 20th century. The colonial government lost no time in taxing the retail spirit shop dealers, who cried, "Unfair!" The end of the 1860s and the 1870s saw the Portuguese well entrenched in business. The roster of Portuguese entrepreneurs was extensive. Apart from being property owners, there were provision and commission merchants, spirit shop owners, importers, ironmongers, ship chandlers, leather merchants, boot and shoemakers, saddlers, coach builders, woodcutters, timber merchants, brickmakers, cattle owners, pork knockers, charcoal dealers, bakers and photographers. The commercial success of the Portuguese was noted in the Royal Gazette. Quote, "The rise of the Portuguese in this colony from a state of most abject poverty to one of comparative affluence, and to the possession, in many instances, of thousands of dollars within the space of a few years, is one of the most remarkable occurrences in modern colonial history." Unquote. This unprecedented success of the Portuguese in business aroused the jealousy and animosity of the Africans, to such an extent that riots resulted. In one especially violent one, the 1856 Angel Gabriel riots, Portuguese shops were extensively damaged. Shops, but not lives.
The reactions to this group of immigrants and views regarding them fluctuated throughout the first 25 years of their residence in the colony. The governors, the Creoles, the press, and public opinion in general continuously upgraded or downgraded the Portuguese according to the exigencies of the time. In the early 1830s, they were looked on as welcome, worthwhile laborers. In the 1840s, Governor Light hardly mentioned the Portuguese without the accompanying epithet, filthy or dirty. Theirs was a grasping avarice. Feelings against the Portuguese ran high. As far as the Creoles were concerned, these aliens had not only become their economic rivals, but had also ousted them to become the entrepreneurs of the day. In 1847 and 1848, climaxed by the 1856 riots, the Portuguese experienced the dire results of that growing anger. In the early 1850s, Governor Berkeley described the Portuguese as industrious and useful. The colonists railed against them for the most part, then surprisingly changed tactics, observing in an 1854 editorial that the Madeira was preferable to any other immigrant. No one, however, could ignore the fact that the Portuguese had reached a high water mark in business by 1860. Many were shopkeepers and owners of a substantial amount of property. By 1860, a mere 477 out of a population of 9,819 worked as indentured laborers on sugar estates. Governor Francis Hicks underlined this fact in one of his dispatches to the Colonial Office in 1863. The Portuguese have acquired by purchase 1/3 of the real property of the city and are decidedly a class of the population which has made the greatest progress in acquiring wealth. This progress in acquiring wealth had definite repercussions, not only angering the Africans, but also irking the colonial elite whose monopoly in trade had been broached. Most Madeirans who came were Catholic. They brought not only their agricultural expertise, but their faith as well. The Madeirans were profoundly religious. Their religious festas were celebrated with joyful abundant pomp and splendor. In the social structure of 19th century Guyana, the key factors in the preservation of the Portuguese group identity were their close-knit family relationships and their adherence to the Catholic faith. Their overt love for their church, their exuberant celebrations of major as well as minor religious feasts served as a bond among them and set them apart from the Anglicans, who were the majority of Christians in the colony. Centuries of suspicion and dislike of Catholics, fruit of Reformation history, had been bred into the bone. To be a Catholic was to be un-English by both birth and religion. Portuguese Catholics were regarded as of little worth in the eyes of the high church Anglicans. Not only did shopkeeper become a synonym for the Portuguese, but also the name Catholic. In response, the Portuguese expressed their Catholicism even more overtly, especially in the building of churches and schools, which, in time, came to be respected. With the arrival of Portuguese-speaking priests, the Catholic Church advanced rapidly. In 1861, Sacred Heart Church was built for the Portuguese and by the Portuguese. Other churches rose all over the country, along the east coast and east bank of Demerara and in Essequibo. Of all the religious customs transmitted by the Portuguese, the Christmas novena continues to hold sway among Catholic Guyanese of every ethnic origin. Another Madeiran custom was the establishment of confraternities, guilds, and societies for the release of widows, orphans, the sick, unemployed, the elderly, and the imprisoned, as well as for the education of the children of their members. As early as the 1840s, the Portuguese were holding dinners for the poor in Georgetown. This characteristic trait of the Portuguese was an expression of their religious upbringing. Every major feast of the church usually ended with a distribution of food and clothing to the poor in the area.
By 1882, official immigration from Madeira to Demerara had ended. Yet there continued to be much movement of both people and goods between Demerara and Funchal. The daily newspapers provided full lists of passengers, many of whom were returning from or going to Madeira on holiday or on business. The Ferreira, a very popular bark, among others, carried on a brisk trade. Potatoes, wine, garlic, fish, onions and coriander seeds poured in to stock the many provision shops. It seems, however, there was among the poorer Portuguese a desire to leave the colony, especially after the 1891 riots. Notices appeared in the Madeiran press stating that the Portuguese were anxious to leave Demerara. At the same time, Portuguese businesses continued to grow in number and in variety. Innumerable wood grants and coal grants along the Demerara and Pomeroon rivers belonged to the Portuguese, as well as cattle farms along the east coast Demerara. One very young Portuguese, Charles Cesar Cunha, he died at the age of 37, conducted extensive operations in the timber business at Malali Demerara River and was regarded as, quote, one of the largest grant holders in the district, unquote, also possessing a great knowledge of the balata industry. It was noted in the combined court that Mr. John Vieira of Springhall, Mahaica, owned the largest cattle farm in the colony. The Portuguese had become owners of a vast amount of property all over the country. Most of the village taxes collected were from the Portuguese property owners. In 1906, the brick factory of H. de Freitas was flourishing, and the chocolate and cocoa factory of Monsieur de Garan Brothers was producing excellent chocolate products as well as fancy chocolates in what was noted as the most well-ventilated building in the colony. The Demerara leather and boot factory was owned by M.G. de Freitas. The Guyana match factory, founded in the latter part of the 19th century, had a host of Portuguese directors and shareholders. The pawnbrokeries in the colony owed their beginnings and growth to the Portuguese. The most notable one, the Portuguese pawnbrokery in Robin Hink streets, was yielding healthy profits in the first decades of the 20th century. The Portuguese had their finger in every commercial pie, in hotels, agencies, shipping, factories of every kind. In the 1920s, the Regent and Tower, and in the 1930s, the Park, were the leading hotels. The schooners of M.P. Camacho and Monsieur Silva Brothers, later John Finance Limited, plied the Caribbean.
The Portuguese held on to their language throughout the 19th century. Language, above all, became the bond, binding them together and making the severance from home more bearable. This helps to explain the ardent desire of the Portuguese for priests speaking to them of their faith in their own language. It was stated that they wept for joy when they heard the first sermon preached in Portuguese, quite a few years after their arrival in British Guyana. Later, schools were established by the Portuguese to ensure that the Portuguese language was kept alive, which, in turn, would sustain their culture. Both girls and boys were taught the language. Boys were expected to help in the shops where the ordering of goods from Madeira and Portugal was naturally conducted in Portuguese. Often, the entire family worked in the provisions shops. Thus, there was no whittling away of profits in wages to outsiders, nor massive loss through theft. Each member of the family was committed to making a success of the business, as he or she had a stake in it. In this area, too, the Portuguese carried on a Madeiran custom. In the shops in Madeira, grandparents, wife, and children shared the shopkeeping with the man of the shop. There was also a powerful family network, somewhat like a family mafia, of family relationships of brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, and the very significant godmothers and godfathers. For one reason or another, many children grew up in the home of or under protection of godmothers and or godfather, compadre. Many businessmen and shopkeepers in villages brought over their relatives from Madeira to work in their shops. Although this was done in the name of self-interest, the relatives were able to set up their own shops as the years went by. An undoubted love of family did not seem to hinder the Portuguese men from having liaisons outside the family hearth. It was not unknown for the father of a so-called happy family to have a mistress or two. Weddings loomed large in Portuguese family life. They illustrated not only a strong bond among families, but also among the Portuguese society. As the wealth of the Portuguese increased, the weddings became even more sumptuous and grandiose. These fashionable extravaganzas were witnessed by large crowds. Those who wished admission to the ceremony, if uninvited, had to procure a ticket for cathedral or church. Two such fashionable weddings took place at the turn of the century. In 1900, João Gomes de Gar, MD, married Filomena Maria de Freitas in 1902. J.P. Santos, founder of the still operating J.P. Santos & Co. Limited, married for the second time Marie José Mendonça. The wedding guests were almost exclusively Portuguese. The Portuguese, like all other immigrant groups, were clannish. Obituaries reported in the press highlighted the rags to riches history of many of the Portuguese. Many noted that the deceased gentleman who came to British Guyana years ago had amassed a considerable fortune by his industry and perseverance. Fortunes were between $100,000 and $500,000. When Mr. José Gomes de Gar died in 1893, he was said to have left a fortune of $400,000, which grew from the small provision business he started when he arrived in the colony in 1842. Often, these Portuguese entrepreneurs owned business in Madeira as well as in British Guyana. Funds were also used for building houses for their relatives or for themselves in Madeira. These became known as Demerara houses. A number of Portuguese newspapers kept the Portuguese in touch with events in Madeira and in the colony. Voz Português, O Licitano, Crônica Seminal, and The Watchman, among others. There were at least 6 Portuguese language newspapers produced in Guyana between 1872 and 1900.
The Portuguese worked hard, but they also played hard. The Portuguese entered the cultural stream of music and drama in the British Guianese society. Plays and concerts were held at the Assembly Rooms and at the Philharmonic Hall. Noted for their musical bands in Madeira, the Portuguese formed the 1º de Dezembro, 1st of December band, which played at every festivity in the colony and regularly on the seawall, the Botanic and Promenade Gardens, the Town Hall and the Assembly Rooms. Important Portuguese national anniversaries were fully and lavishly celebrated. On 5th June, the date commemorating the proclamation of the Constitutional Charter in Madeira, the Portuguese celebrated BG with concerts and balls. The 1893 ball, held at the Assembly Rooms, was a glittering affair attended by the Portuguese elite, with the Portuguese consul in full state uniform. The supper was sumptuous, wines and delicacies of the first class. A toast was drunk to the King and Queen of Portugal. The Daily Liberal, a local newspaper, considered it, quote, a celebration unequalled in the annals of Guyana, insofar as their countrymen were concerned, unquote. Another national day which gave rise to patriotic celebrations was 1st of December, day of the restoration for Portugal, when in 1640 the Portuguese threw off the Spanish yoke which had held them for 60 years. In BG, this day was celebrated with recitals and other functions. On that day in 1876, the 1º de Dezembro band was founded. It was the oldest Portuguese institution in the colony. This band played at all church and secular functions, a great favourite with the Georgetown population at large, who enjoyed their famous seawall concerts. In 1898, the Portuguese community organised celebrations to honour the 400th anniversary of the famous Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama's discovery of the sea route to India in 1498. The Portuguese houses and business firms were elaborately decorated with flags, buntings, and were marvellously illuminated. Portuguese businesses, even the spirit shops, were closed. The day opened with the singing of the solemn Te Deum at Sacred Heart Church, and climaxed with a concert at the Promenade Gardens, at which both the British Guiana militia and the 1st of December, 1º de Dezembro bands played selections. especially the Portuguese national anthem, Hino da Carta. During the afternoon, there was a cyclist parade at which prizes were awarded for unique cycle decorations representing da Gama's ship, Portuguese arms, and other Portuguese motifs. So densely packed was the crowd that it was difficult to get the race started in High Street. To commemorate the day in a more lasting way, the Vasco da Gama's Cycling Club was formed. At this point in the colony's history, the people of British Guiana did not really see themselves as Guyanese. Neither did they normally consider themselves as still belonging to their native land. They were British subjects. Most of the Portuguese were still Portuguese and not British subjects. Though resident in a British colony for years, they did not wish to become naturalised. No wonder they were considered aliens. By the 1920s, they were considered by the press more upper than middle class. Each ethnic group seemed to have its strata of classes. The upper classes of the white governing group did not mix with the upper classes of the wealthy Portuguese, Africans, Indians, or Chinese. Each group formed its own ghetto of clubs. In May 1924, the Portuguese consul, J.B. Ferreira da Silva, founded the Portuguese Club at Nonpareil Park. He was the first chairman, with J.P. Santos and S.S. de Freitas as vice presidents. Honorary members, other members and associates were all elected by the founding committee and drawn from the professional and business ranks of Portuguese society. By the end of the 19th century, there was definitely an elite group possessing fortunes. It was mostly from this group that sons and daughters were sent for higher education in Europe. The girls were mostly sent to Lisbon.
The one area of integration which the Guyanese attained then and still possessed to a great degree was in the realm of food. In the early years of Portuguese immigration, much of the mortality among the Portuguese was caused by dysentery and diarrhea, from eating foods to which they were unaccustomed. Hence, they were eager to obtain from Madeira the foodstuffs which they could use to cook their own type of food. Thus, by the 1840s, ships were bringing cargoes of onions, potatoes, garlic, saltfish, couscous, and of course their wines, which they were used to drinking with their meals and which no doubt helped to fortify them. Thus, into the Guyanese diet were introduced bacalhau, saltfish, cabbage and pumpkin soup, couscous, brioche, biscuits, bolo gemel, molasses cake, and above all, carne de porco do alho, garlic pork, a favorite among all Guyanese people today. Madeira wines had been imported into British Guyana long before the Madeirans came. Madeira was a favorite wine among the planters, but the drinking of Madeira was not limited to the planter class. Governor Henry Berkeley, when assuring a former slave that his wages were sufficient to support him, was told that those wages could not cover his purchase of Madeira and him. The Creoles shared their love of Madeira wines with the Portuguese, whose shops stocked casks and demijohns of that commodity. Impetuous and irascible though they were, the Madeiran immigrants also possessed a warmth of feeling towards family and friends and were known to be loyal and true. They enjoyed jokes, especially practical jokes, and had a great propensity for nicknames. The nicknames were always very apt, namely, a man of great size was called Birdie. It seems that this liking for nicknames was especially noted among the people of Madeira, where families were called pumpkin, frying pan, codfish. In Demerara, the Madeirans carried on this tradition. Every Portuguese shopkeeper was a Mr. Jose or Manizing. On the reverse side of the coin, the Portuguese were called Portuguese by the Creoles, and this derogatory label has stuck even to the present day. However much the Portuguese added to the cultural dimension in music, drama, and sport, their entry into the political field took much longer. First, there was the language barrier. Secondly, most of the Portuguese men were not naturalized British subjects. And thirdly, the government constantly cautioned the Portuguese not to meddle with politics, but to stick to business. Not until 1906 did the Portuguese run for office, with F.I. Dias and J.P. Santos winning seats in the Court of Policy and Combined Court. However, although the Portuguese had gained a political foothold, they were not welcomed with open arms into the colonial government. By the turn of the century, the Portuguese had created their own middle and upper class. They were never accepted into the echelons of white European society, though they themselves were Europeans. The rapid economic progress of the Portuguese, their strong adherence to the Catholic faith, and their clannishness bred respect, but never wholehearted acceptance among the population, either in the 19th or 20th century. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Portuguese suffered discrimination. Many crossed the ocean in search of another El Dorado in the north. Maybe in the spirit of the early Portuguese explorers who lived to the hilt the motto of Prince Henry the Navigator, "Go further."
This was not a simple tale of absorption and acceptance. As Joanne Ferreira writes, during the early post-emancipation era and up to the end of the 19th century, there were several anti-Portuguese attacks from 1846 to 1891. These attacks took the form of mild looting to serious rioting. 4 attacks took place in 1846, 1847, 1848 and 1865. There was also serious anti-Portuguese rioting in the form of the Angel Gabriel riots of 1856 and others in 1889 and 1891. Finally, in the 20th century, ethnocultural clubs were disallowed in Guyana despite the existence of Portuguese social and cultural clubs for several years in that territory. Based on government policy aimed at ending all social entrenched forms of discrimination, all ethnic clubs had to change their names to ones that did not reflect an ethnic base or bias. The Portuguese club therefore became Nonpareil Park, the Chinese club became Cosmos, and the Indian sports club became Everest. In both the 19th and 20th centuries, there was massive remigration of many Guyanese Portuguese and others to North America and Great Britain, and also to Trinidad to some extent. Today, the Guyanese Portuguese community has diminished to the extent that it is no longer a distinct and separate community as it was up to the mid-20th century. The majority of Guyanese Portuguese constituting a growing diaspora in North America and the UK. Having lost or given up their ancestral language and other identity markers, the Portuguese in Trinidad, for example, have turned to one favourite Christmas dish, Madeiran garlic pork, or canefield as the characteristic symbol of Portuguese ethnicity. This tradition is shared by a large number of Guyanese of both Portuguese origin and other. It is therefore mainly at Christmas time that any vestige of Portuguese identity temporarily but enthusiastically resurfaces and manifests itself in the Caribbean.